Welcome to Soul Care with Stevie Boy, episode 27. We're in the book of Philippians, and we have looked at briefly, well, I say briefly, but I kind of pulled it apart last episode where Paul talks about his son in the faith, Timothy. And maybe as high of a reference or high a regard as Paul could have for anyone. Listen to what he says in verse 20. I have no one else like him who will show genuine concern for your welfare, for everyone looks out for their own interests, not those of Jesus Christ. And we talked about how that could be a very sad epitaph for many American churches that are so inwardly focused and so ingrown that they look out only for their own interests. God, may it never be that our fellowships, that your family would be that self-centered and that preoccupied with themselves. I think if Paul were to come back today and would see the state of some churches, and some churches I'm even familiar with, I think he would be revolted. I think he'd come on very strongly. Well, in his situation, and the specific thing we're looking at right now, can you imagine the emotional content, the weight of that phrase, that everybody here is only looking out for their own interests, not for the interests of Jesus Christ. When you look at him in his situation, he's, as what our understanding is, that he's under house arrest in Rome, probably chained to guards in some form or another, 24/7. His rights to move about fully restricted to within the house. He was able to secure his own lodging and all of that, and Timothy was there with him, along with another individual we'll see a little bit in just a moment. And yet, it's not the happiest of situations for Paul. And I think what weighed on him more than his incarceration or his limited freedom was the fact that he looked around and saw so few people who had the interest of Christ first in their heart. In verse 22, but you know that Timothy has proved himself, because as a son with his father, he has served with me in the work of the gospel. I had a great privilege as a young minister working with a couple of mature guys who mentored me and treated me as a son. And one of them, the first full-time ministry I had, this idea of being treated like son was a little bit, there was a time or two where he took me to the emotional woodshed, and he should have, because I had made some boneheaded mistakes and I needed the discipline that he could bring. The second of those guys was much less of a woodshed guy, but my gracious, the example of his life. He was an amazing and consistent follower of Christ and lover of people. I think Timothy had the huge privilege of that relationship with the Apostle Paul. It's interesting to me that we don't have any existing documents from Timothy. I would love to have been able to look into his life, look into his heart and mind, and gather any of the good stuff that he had, but those things don't exist. But Paul said Timothy has proved himself, because as a son with his father, he has served with me in the work of the gospel. Don't run over too quickly that Timothy proved himself as he served with Paul in the work of the gospel. In terms of dedicated, I don't know what word to use. Today we would call it full-time Christian service or ministry, or even bivocational ministry is work. I know there are a lot of people who think that the pastor, the preacher works one day a week on Sunday, the only day they really see him. And if, there's a few people that show up on Wednesday night and okay, they see him there. And so, no, I can tell you, I only had 45 years of located ministry experience, but that was enough for me to tell you, man, if a guy lets it, ministry, the occupation of ministry, can consume their life. And I don't think that's what Paul was saying, but I think what he was saying is Timothy didn't shirk the work. He was willing to lean into it. At verse 23, I hope, therefore, to send him as soon as I see how things go with me. That's an interesting thing, because you remember just like a couple of episodes ago, we focused on the idea where Paul said, but even if I am being poured out like a drink offering, and which is an allusion to the fact that he felt he could easily have been in his last days. He didn't know that his life was going to go on, but here he has this optimism that he would. I hope to. I'm confident that I will also come and see you soon. Well, excuse me. Then he goes on, but I think it is necessary to send back to you Epaphroditus, my brother, co-worker, and fellow soldier, who is also your messenger, whom you sent to take care of my needs. This is the first time that we see Epaphroditus showing up. Epaphroditus was a Philippian. It was one of the members of the Philippian church that they had sent to Rome, and who had found Paul, and had what we conjecture from this, and a little bit later in the book we get a little more insight on it. Excuse me. Wow, I gotta quit eating that. The what we conjecture is that they had not only sent their money with Epaphroditus, which was important, but they had sent him as their personal representative to stand in for them. I don't know. We have so little information about Epaphroditus. And like Timothy, he didn't leave behind any documents that we can gain insight from. But I think if I was going to send somebody on a journey of that length in those days, and I would entrust them with cash, money, and I knew that they were going to stand in for me on my behalf in what could be a difficult, at least challenging situation. That kind of guy wasn't just every other guy in the crowd. See, that a guy who you would trust in that way would have been in the top 3 or 4% of the people in that church family. I think Epaphroditus ought to get more attention and more honor than he generally gets. We don't even know the specific things that he did, but we're going to find out a little bit more about who he was and how he served. Paul calls him his brother. And that's simple. He's brother in Christ, a co-worker. And that means he wasn't just an observer. He didn't just come to hang out and see what was going on and be a little bit of encouragement. He rolled up his tunic sleeves and he dove into the work. And fellow soldier. Paul occasionally uses these military metaphors of himself and others in the work of the gospel as soldiers. And then he says, who is also your messenger, whom you sent to take care of my needs. Verse 26. For he longs for all of you and is distressed because you heard he was ill. Indeed, he was ill and almost died. That's a very telling little short sentence. Epaphroditus wanted to go back because he longed to see his friends and his family back in Philippi. And he wanted to assure them, because they had heard that he was sick, and he wanted to show, I'm good. But Paul says he was sick. Actually, he almost died. Think about this. If you were with the Apostle Paul and you were sick, probably wasn't much better place to be. I would rather be with the Apostle Paul. No disrespect for the Dr. Luke, but the state of ancient medicine was not very good. The odds of getting well were way higher with Paul than they were with Luke. And not because of medicine, but because of what we see in Paul's life, the power that God used through him to heal people. Now, what Paul doesn't say here is that Epaphroditus was really, really sick, so much so that we thought he was going to die, but I healed him. He didn't say that. He said, indeed, he was ill and almost died. My wife and I took a trip to Haiti once. Our daughter was working in a mission there, and we went. I went to do some teaching for the staff, and of course we went to see our daughter. While I was there, though, I picked up the bug, and I was sick as a dog. I didn't think I was going to die, but man, I was sick. There is almost nothing as miserable as being sick and not being in your own home, in your own bed. I hate being sick anyway, but I hate being sick when I'm away from home. I wasn't sick unto death, not nearly. And here was Epaphroditus, who, ill to the point of death, away from home. And you have to remember, we're talking first century. People died in the first century of diarrhea. People died in the first century of dehydration because of dysentery. It was no small thing. And here was Epaphroditus, far from home, yes, with the Apostle Paul, yes, with Timothy, and yes, with a roof over his head, as far as we can tell, but he was very, very sick. Paul continues, but God had mercy on him, and not only on him, but also on me, to spare me sorrow upon sorrow. That doesn't sound to me like Paul said, it was no problem to me because I knew I would just heal him and the whole thing would go away. I don't have any right to throw rocks at anybody, but I have to be honest with you and say that sometimes the things I hear from people who make a claim of being this kind of powerful faith healer, it doesn't sound like Paul. Now, I'm going to say there are people who have the humility that Paul expresses here and the gratitude that he expresses, and they have a ministry where, as a result of their prayers and the faith of people, folks are healed. That happens. I do not dispute that. But here Paul, of all people, Peter or Paul, could have said, yeah, be healed. Boom, there it is. I don't have the impression that happened with Epaphroditus. I don't have any doubt in my mind that Paul prayed for him. I suspect he probably anointed him with oil and laid hands on him to pray, because that was the practice of the early church. I don't know that his recovery was instantaneous and miraculous in that way. Paul said God had mercy on him, and not only on him, but also on me, to spare me sorrow upon sorrow. Paul kind of waxes poetic here. How deeply his affection ran for Epaphroditus. And then in verse 28, therefore I am all the more eager to send him to you, so that when you see him again, you may be glad, and I may have less anxiety. As though Paul were saying, I don't want you to worry, because if I think you're worried, then it produces anxiety in me. I want to send him back to you, so you can see him, and you will be glad to see him. I know you will be. Verse 29. So then, welcome him in the Lord with great joy and honor people like him, because he almost died for the work of Christ. And then this idea, he risked his life to make up for the help you yourselves could not give me. Let's back up a little bit. So then, welcome him in the Lord with great joy and honor people like him. I want you to think about the last time you had a missionary come to your church. Now, there are exceptions to this, but I'll confess to you that generally some of the most dry, dead dry, boring slide presentations that I have ever witnessed were at the hands of wonderful missionary people. Their gift is not making presentations to American churches. If they're gifted as a missionary, as they ought to be, if they are one, then their gift is in bringing the gospel to people. My question, and then I'm going to end, is how much honor do they get from us? Unfortunately, my experience is they get dinner and a visit, and we'll write them a little check and send them on their way, and feel that we've done our duty for that 6 months or a year for world missions. This is wrong, simply wrong. We'll come back to it next time. I'm going to close. I hope you join me next time for Soul Care with Stevie Boy.